One. You know my guest from The Rise of the Ottomans on Netflix and his book 1453 and more. Still, my guest today is none other than Roger Crowley. Welcome to the podcast, sir.
Thank you very much, Ellen. I'm always delighted to get a chance to talk about Constantinople, Istanbul.
So you wrote the book 1453, and what inspired you to write it?
Well, in the early 1970s, when I was quite young, I went to live in Istanbul for a while, sort of period of a year on and off. And I was amazed by the city, by the historical depth of the city. And I thought about this. It stayed in my memory and my imagination for a long time. After 9/11, I'd read the one book that existed on the fall of Constantinople by a very famous Byzantine historian, British historian called Stephen Runciman. And I realized that what mattered to Runciman was that the tragedy was that it was the end of the classical world, of the world of Greece and Rome. And that's what mattered to him. After 9/11, and we started to think in more detail, about relations with Islam and Christianity and so on, and the long chain of events, I realized that there was another way of looking at this story, which was really less about the fact that the classical world had died and all that learning had disappeared. It was that here was one of those events and relationships between the Islamic world and the Christian world that could be reconsidered and looked at again. And I think that was the basis of it. But beneath that was my love of the city, being able to walk the city, see the monuments that were there in the 15th century and are still there, and to be able to inhabit the past in a certain way.
And did you feel the presence of probably similar question, but did you feel the presence of the history and people that lived in the city for so long when you walked through Istanbul?
Yes, absolutely, you do. I mean, you can stand on the great city walls. You can see where they were eroded by Ottoman gunfire. You can go down into the underground cisterns where people hid. You can go into the great mother church of Hagia Sophia, where the population sheltered themselves before the final attack on the city. And you can map the places and events, because the street layout of modern Istanbul, of the old city, is identical with that of the Byzantine city, almost going right back to the time of Constantine. So it's very easy to connect with this past here.
I want to start with, because there have been 3 previous attempts, and the only really successful attempt to conquer Constantinople was the Fourth Crusade. What made and there's been 2 previous attempts by the Umayyad Caliphates and his Mehmed's father. I forget his name, forgive me, but why did they fail to conquer Constantinople? What made it such unconquerable up until this point?
They didn't have the technology, with partially it, I think. Mehmed's father, Murad, actually did bring cannon to the walls of the city in the 1420s, but they didn't really do very much damage. So they really failed on a sort of technical level. They, I think, continue to be concerned about the possibility of counter crusades. There have been crusades at Varna in the 1440s and an earlier one. So they were worried about stirring up Christian Europe, I think, and it took the development, the coherent development of an authority of a sultan to be able to gather a mass of support that was large enough, really, to tackle the city. And it was obvious that with the previous Ottoman attempts to take the city, that they simply didn't have that.
So what was the state of the Byzantine Empire at this point? We talked about this before the recording, and I mentioned that they kind of were the sixth man of Europe, as the Ottomans would be in the late 19th century. Is that a correct term?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Byzantine Empire have been in decline for hundreds of years. I mean, important points were the Fourth Crusade in 1204, which shattered the city in many ways and deprived of a lot of trade. If you go deeper back, the incursions of the rise of Islam really removed a lot of territory from the Byzantine Empire and then tax revenues and so on. But as we move forward from there, we have plague, population decline. Plague, the first city in Europe that got the Black Death from the Black Sea, decimated the population in the 1340s. And moving on from there, we have civil war. Really, the emperors of the Byzantine world, there was a huge amount of infighting between different groups. Really, the population declines. Probably by the time of 1453, it was down to about 90,000. It had probably been 500,000 in the year 900 or something like that. So this is a city, and by that stage, it's lost all its land apart from a little area around the city and the Peloponnese in Greece. Everything else is gone. So they've got few natural resources. They also find it difficult to get support from the West because of religious controversy between the Greek Orthodox Church and the Pope in Rome. So really, this is a state which is dying and is coming to the end of its natural life, I think.
Do you think they would have, with or without Mehmed, do you think they would have faded away regardless, that they would have been dying eventually?
Yes, I think almost certainly. If Mehmet hadn't taken the city, probably another Ottoman sultan would have come along and taken it. And most likely, people to extinguish the Byzantine Empire were going to be the Ottomans, the energetic, westward moving people. So its days were numbered. It could not live forever.
And before it goes, I want to take a look at some key characters, but before we start on the battle itself, but before we do that, I want to start about the fortification of Constantinople, and it's quite impressive. And it's that. So tell me about the fortification at this time of Constantinople.
Yeah, it's to a certain extent it's geography. Think of Constantinople as a triangle, two sides of water. One, the Golden Horn, which is a sort of harbor, and the other is the Sea of Mare. At the top, there's a 4-mile sort of land wall, and this land wall, which was the Theodosian Wall, which was first built in the 15th century, was the great piece of military engineering in the late medieval world, a tradition going back to Greco-Roman engineering. This was a formidable obstacle. So the fortifications, the walls, 4 miles long, 192 towers, 3 different zones, an inner wall, a middle wall, an outer wall, moats, ditches, and so on. 100 feet, 30 meters high, and nobody had the technology to crack this wall. So these walls were legendary throughout Europe. If we look back over the whole history of Byzantium was besieged 26 times in 1100 years. That's an average of every 40 years. The Arabs, the Persians, the Russians, the Bulgars, the Huns, Attila the Hun, they all came, and they simply didn't have the resources to take this city. So its fortifications were formidable.
And then they have a chain by the Golden Horn as well. So
they had a chain across the mouth of the Golden Horn, yeah, which prevented ships from entering the harbor. And on the other side, the Sea of Mare, the currents are quite strong. They did have walls on both seaward sides, but they didn't require the same level fortification that the land wall did, the Theodosian, the land frontier.
How effective was this chain if enemy ships wanted to enter the river?
Well, it was effective. It actually depended upon, on the other side of the Golden Horn was the Genoese settlement of Galata, as it's now called. And it really depended upon some cooperation from the Genoese to protect the chain, which indeed they did because they had a joint interest. But it was extremely effective. I mean, actually, this is a common thing in harbors across the Mediterranean. The chain still exists actually in parts of it in a museum in Istanbul, and it's a formidable piece of ironwork. So it worked well, and of course you could defend the chain from ships just behind it. So it was effective.
And this might be a bit. Didn't any other cities in Europe look at the walls and look at the fortification of Constantinople and say we should maybe do that to our city? That this, if we did this, we could be uncomfortable as well. But or was it simply the location of the city that made it so perfect that it was impregnable?
I think the location was critical, really. You see, if you've got a city in the middle of the land, you've got to fortify everything to the same, to the same degree, really. Whereas effectively, the Byzantines concentrate all their defensive efforts on their land wall, and so I think location is very, very important to the city, and indeed it was to the wealth of the city as well, because it sits on the trade routes east west, that's from the Mediterranean to the Black Sea, north south from Europe into Asia Minor and the Arab world. But location is everything, I think.
Would you say that in this medieval world that Constantinople has been one of the most important cities in history because of its location?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, this city, both its forerunners, by Byzantium, Istanbul, because of where it is, it makes it both powerful in a sense that it controls, the gateway between Europe and Asia, but it also makes it vulnerable because at the same time you've got pressures from both sides. So it requires that you hold quite a lot of land mass either side as well, I think. And we can see it now, I think, in modern Turkey trying to carve out a role itself as a powerful figure in the Middle East from its position, between Europe and Asia Minor and the rest of the Islamic world.
Now, we got quite a few key characters in this story that we need to go through, and one of them, I want to start with the emperor at the time, Constantine the 11th, and try to tell me about him.
Constantine was one of a number of sons, but he was the most responsible of them all. I mean, it has to be said that the royal family was a feuding mess, really, and at least one of his brothers had sided with the Ottomans in an earlier attempt on the city. Constantinople was a soldier. We don't know as much about him, I think, as we would like to. I think really because by the time he came to power, the resources for writing biographies and so on had probably disappeared. He was a man in his late 40s. He'd spent all his life. He had a great sense of responsibility. He felt the weight of history on his shoulders, that he was the heir to 1100 years of Byzantine imperial rule, and that it was his responsibility not to drop the ball, you could say, and that he would fight to the last for this city. He was aware of the deep history and the inheritance and responsibility. He spent years in the Peloponnese trying to resist the advance of the Ottomans into Greece, and he was a practical man. He was a strategist, but he didn't have many cards to play. He didn't have a vast armies. He didn't have a lot of natural resources, but he was prepared himself to go down to the last man to defend the deep history of Greek civilization in the city.
And of course, we gotta talk about one of our main men as well, Mehmed II. And how did he? Because he came to the throne quite young, but then it was taken away from it because he wanted to right away attack Constantinople. He didn't want to wait. So tell me about him.
Well, it's a fascinating character, really. I mean, what you have to think about, of course, every Ottoman Sultan is only partially an ethnic Turk, because the harem system, slaves from outside. His mother was probably from
Hungary, wasn't that?
No, not Hungary. Probably modern Serbia or somewhere on the coast of the Adriatic. He was the last surviving son of his father Murad, because for various reasons his other sons had either been killed or died, and there was very little possibility that he would become sultan, but he did. At the age of 12, he was made sultan by his father Murad, rather surprisingly, who wanted to abdicate it, and he was quite a headstrong child, and his under the management of the vizier Halil Pasha, he made a complete mess of running the Ottoman state, and there was a great uprising against him. He introduced unorthodox Muslim preachers into the city. The city was, the capital then was Edirne, or Adrianopolis, which is 150 miles to the west of Istanbul. And in the end, Murat had to come back again. So he wasn't, he wasn't a popular figure. At the same time, he was very deeply influenced. This is an extremely intelligent man. He was very influenced by, he spoke Turkish, he spoke Ottoman Turkish, he spoke Greek, and he probably spoke a Slavic language. And he was very influenced by the figure of Alexander the Great. He had his biography read to him every day in Greek, and he saw himself, I want to see himself as being the Muslim Alexander, whereas Alexander had gone from the west to the east, he was going to go from the east to the west. So he was very, very ambitious. He becomes sultan again with the death of his father at the age of 21.
Well, now I want to ask before you go on, because in the series it made it seem, in the Netflix series, it made it seem that he may not have had a chance to become sultan even after his father's death. Is that true?
Not that I was aware. No, I mean, I think there were no other candidates for, I mean, there were always a few other pretenders to the throne. And one of the Byzantine techniques was to keep a pretender, a cousin or somebody, up their sleeve, if you like, to release him and stir up trouble. In fact, they had one in the city called Orhan at the time.
It's uncle, right?
You probably know better than, probably know my book better than me. I can't remember now. Yeah, I think he probably was. But I don't think there was any doubt that he was going to be sultan. I see, in the Netflix series, a certain element of sort of creativity, possibly, but Turkish historians may well know better than me. But as far as I could see, there was no other likely contender to the throne at this time. But he was ambitious, and he was headstrong, and he'd set his sights on taking Constantinople. This was going to provide him with credibility, and this was his ambition, really, to cement his position as sultan by taking the final prize, what the Turks called the red apple.
How did the pashas feel when he returned to the throne? And specifically older pashas. when he
The,
returned after
the,
his failure as a young sultan.
yeah, Halal Pasha, who was the main vizier, was very nervous about and was trying to restrain Mehmed, particularly from Constantinople, going for Constantinople. However, he had other pashas who were, there's kind of a bit of a thing being played out here between the old Turkish aristocracy and the new viziers who are coming in, who are of Albanian or Greek origin under the Ottoman slave system. These were boys who have been captured as children, brought into the palace system, risen through the ranks, and these some of these other pashas, such as Zaganos Pasha, were very encouraging. And Halal says this is dangerous. If you get this wrong, there will be a revolt. Again by the Ottoman troops, and this is risky. This is very risky. So there's a certain amount of power play going on among the advisors around the young sultan, but Mehmed is going to do what he's going to do. So and he takes more advice, I think, from those people who've got something to gain from this. This campaign, rather than Halal Pasha, who'd seen his one failure as a young man.
We're going to talk about Halal Pasha in just a moment, but before that, I want to talk about Giovanni Justini. And I'm sorry if I say his name wrong, but how does he come into the picture?
Giovanni Justini comes from a Genoese family. They actually own an island called Chios, or just off the coast of Asia Minor, Turkey. And Giustiniani was what you might call a soldier of fortune, a kind of professional soldier. Mercenary, really, yep. But his main skill was what they called wall fighting, effectively, the defending of fortified places. And it seems that he came, I don't know if exactly on his own initiative, but Constantine promised him certain territories. And so he comes with not a large force, about 700 men. It's not a big force. Genoese and various other mercenaries, typical figures of the late medieval world, weapons for hire, if you like. But his arrival in the city is greeted with great enthusiasm. That there is some support coming from outside, and he is going to be an instrumental figure because the contest more or less is going to be not exclusively, it's going to be fought along the land wall. Giustiniani really becomes the strategic director of the defenses of the city.
Do you think that the battle would have been shorter without Giustiniani?
I would think it probably would have been, yes. I think there was probably nobody in the city who had that kind of depth of experience of warfare and of siege management that this man had.
And I believe he was sort of a prime minister role in this Lotus Notares.
Yeah.
My Greek isn't that great, but it's how. Talk to me about the relationship. Did he have a relationship with Halal Pasha, and did they try to stop the war from happening?
I'm not sure about that, looking back on it. And in point fact, I can't quite remember what I said in the book now. Maybe tell me. Lucas Notares came from aristocratic Greek family. He was a soldier himself, quite a skilled soldier, who commanded certain sections of the walls. Running through this is one of the fundamental weaknesses of Constantine's position is really around religion, because this is moving slightly sideways from a question, but between the Orthodox Greeks and the Catholics, and the Pope's demand that he wouldn't really send help to the city unless the Greek Orthodox submitted to the authority of the Pope. And Lucas Notares was a Greek Orthodox. So Constantine, for pragmatic reasons, was willing to do the deal, but Lucas Notares wasn't. So this probably caused some little friction within the city of, but he was the leading Greek Orthodox authority, really, in terms of warfare and management. To be honest, I can't remember what his relationship with Halal Pasha was, I'm afraid. I'm going to pass over that one.
That's okay. But one of the final characters we will have to talk about is Mother Mara, and she was from the Ottoman harem, and Mehmed seemed to rather look up to her. So tell me about her relationship with Mehmed and her role in this.
She was his mother-in-law, and I think they were very close. I have no sense of her presence at all during this siege, so it's really difficult to say that she had much influence in the situation, but she undoubtedly was the mother figure that in a way he didn't have, because growing up as an Ottoman prince was a pretty chilly experience. You would be taken away from your own mother at a young age, and he was sent off to Eastern Turkey to be a governor at the age of 10 or something, with tutors and so on. So he really didn't have a family life. And I think she substituted this. She entered his life as a mother, really, and was, he undoubtedly was, and this could probably be true of many of the Ottoman sultans, the Ottoman system was really not designed to create people with loving family relationships. And by all accounts, Mehmet was cool, distant to people, and cold by nature. And she, I think, was one warm spot in his life.
And this brings us to the basilica canon, and Urban, the Hungarian, he does try to sell his canon, which is extraordinary piece of engineering for his time and way ahead of the times, if I may say so, because looking at the canon, it's quite gigantic, and it's huge, but in that way, it's not what you haven't. I don't think you see anything like this in medieval Europe at this point. And tell me about Urban and his basilica canon.
Urban is a Hungarian. At the start of the 15th century, we start to see canon founders. It comes out of a blacksmithing tradition, I think, of people who worked in foundries.
Actually, how does how he got around to design this canon?
We don't in detail as to where the background to this came from. There were large bombards being made across Europe. I think there's one in Belgium called Dulagrit or something. These things were around. We know very little about. We know almost nothing about Orban. Orban realizes these are hired hands. This is a man with a skill. They're mercenaries in the way that they're technical mercenaries. Go to the man who's going to give you some money. And being probably of Christian origin, he went first of all to Constantinople to see Constantine. These are very, very expensive things to create. You need an awful lot of material. You have to build a certain amount of technical infrastructure to create furnaces and so on. And Constantine simply didn't have the money. He just didn't have the money. He's impoverished. The resources are not there. So he says, okay, I'll go to the next possible source. And that, of course, was Mehmet in Edirne. And
He
so
looks at the canon and he accepts the deal that he don't make him the canon.
that's right. And so we get this extraordinary process, which is described in quite a lot of detail of creating molds, clay molds, superheating the metal. A lot of the metal for these cannon would have come from melting down the Christian bells of the Balkans. So, turning plowshares into swords, if you want to reverse the thing. And there's an extraordinary scene where this enormous cannon, which was vast weight and large enough for a man to crawl into the mouth of, was given a test firing outside the city of Edirne. And women are told to stay inside in case, if they're pregnant, they might miscarry their unborn children and so on. It's really talked up in the chronicle accounts. And the test firing proves very successful. It travels across the plain for a kilometer or two, buries itself a couple of meters in the ground, and then they start to transport this thing, this mighty machine, towards the city walls. It is both a practical weapon, but also a psychological. There's a psychological element to this, which Mehmed was very good at deploying, really sending out the information to Constantine. This thing is coming, it will destroy your city. It takes something like 6 weeks and a vast number of men to haul this. They had to build new bridges across some of the rivers to drag this great machine to the city walls at a speed of sort of a couple of kilometers a day. And but at the same time, they're building a whole lot of smaller cannons as well. This is the showpiece gun, but they had about 70 other cannons. And this is a remarkable tribute to the ability of the Ottomans to embrace new technology and the resources to do so, because what you need to put up any kind of continuous bombardment is a very sophisticated supply chain. It's not just getting the cannons to the walls. You have to supply gunpowder. You have to supply cannonballs, stone cannonballs at this time of the right diameter for the different sizes of cannons. These cannons balls are carved on the northern shores of the Black Sea. They're put in ships and then they're transported over land. So the logistical requirements to put up a continuous bombardment are formidable. And we think of the Ottomans as being very good soldiers, but they were very good fighters. They were also very good at the logistical management, the supply chains, the ability to make gunpowder, transport these things. They even had set up mobile forges outside the city walls where they could recast or repair cannons. So this is the supply side of gunpowder warfare in the 15th century is remarkable from an Ottoman point of view.
Did any specialized cannonballs or this, or what did normal cannonballs work for this cannon?
No, as far as I know, I mean, there are some of these cannonballs lying around actually in Istanbul now. They are. I'm not sure geologically what they were. They came from some rock strata on the. I mean, what you want is a very hard material. This is actually very deep knowledge actually within the Islamic world, because in the Crusades, when the Islamic, the Mamluk dynasty destroyed the last Christian stronghold at Acre in 1291, they were consciously finding rocks and getting that were suitably hard enough to. You really need to be able to hit the walls with something very hard. So whether these were granite, they would have sought out rock strata which were very hard. So it's very sophisticated stuff going on here.
Mm. And then they finally arise, but they have to conquer, and like you said, territory along the way as they go on, and it finally reaches the city wall. Does it try to make an ultimatum with Constantine first with the White
Um,
Wall?
it was traditional within the Islamic system of siege warfare that you always sent out an ambassador to say, we give you the chance to surrender peacefully. And you know, I'm not quite sure exactly what form that took with Constantine, or whether it was, and you can sail away. But this was never going to, because of what I've said about Constantine, his determination to defend the city at all costs. This is never going to go anywhere. This was a bit of a formality, sending out the ritual. You probably might have just had somebody standing in front of the wall shouting out, saying, but they probably had somebody who came in and said, you know, you can surrender peacefully, or you will all be slaughtered. But Constantine dismissed it completely. He was not going to listen to any possibility of negotiated surrender.
Did Mehmed secretly hope that he would surrender, that he would avoid battle, bloodshed?
I'm sorry?
Did Mehmed secretly hope that he would accept the surrender, or was he hoping for bloodshed?
We don't really know. I mean, he obviously, he wanted to keep, it's clear that he wanted to keep a living city, really. He didn't want this place to be destroyed. And there are various points towards the end of the siege where he repeats this offer. So it's always in his interest not to have to fight his way in. And towards the end, the offer was made again and turned down. So I think in between the long periods of fighting, he hoped that he could do this without bloodshed and without damage to the city.
So the battle begins. So tell me about the battle itself, because it lasts 53 days, which is that long time for a battle? What was average sieging, for put it that way, in medieval world?
Well, in the Islamic tradition, sieges tended to be quite short. They did not try to starve people out, which indeed would have been hopeless here. And generally, what happens is you bring an awful lot of people to the siege, huge numbers of people, with promises of plunder, with religious messages of fighting for the faith and so on. So you get a lot of people, some of whom are regular soldiers, but a lot of recruits. But the people have come here for plunder. And for various reasons, the Ottomans knew that you could not retain a large army outside the city walls for very long, both for reasons of morale, but also for reasons of hygiene. You cannot keep supplying a large number of people, keep water clean, deal with sewage and so on. The Ottomans are very good at managing these things, but really 4 to 5 weeks is the maximum. And beyond that, you tend to get trouble among the troops, and people start to leave, or the commander's position becomes difficult. This siege actually goes on for 7 weeks, and that was an unusually long time for a siege. And I think it was a combination, really, of how important this city was, how rich they thought it was, but also of Islamic prophecy. There was a lot of Islamic prophecy about that. The Prophet Muhammad had prophesied the taking of this city. There's a great deal of religious, if you like, jihadi enthusiasm for this that keeps it going for 7 weeks.
And what is Constantine and their reaction when they see the basilica for the first time outside the city, and the effect of the basilica?
Well, the effect of the basilica is absolutely traumatic. They've never seen anything like this, and the shattering of these great stone bullets against the walls, some of them passing over the walls into the city and destroying buildings inside, the roar of the cannon, the smoke, and so on. This frightened people. It was, and it was kind of, in some respects, because it was a very superstitious religious background to this, in terms of this could be the end of the world. This kind of played into the psychological mentality of the Byzantine people, that we are looking at apocalypse. Could this be the end of the world? So its psychological effect was enormous, actually, in terms of exposure to mass gunpowder weapons, which they'd never experienced before. So the psychological effect was very important, obviously, as well as the material effects of the cannon. The basilica itself is kind of quite interesting, because Orban had obviously been working at the limits of what you could do with large cannons, and more than one one of the kings of Scotland was killed by standing too close to a cannon that exploded, and you see this it's slightly in the Netflix series. It's slightly overplayed, because but the basilica cracked and had to be recast. And over time, it appears that the slightly smaller cannon, working in teams of three, where they, like a triangle, you try and position two shots lower down and one above to try and bring down a section of wall, were probably more effective. But we don't know what happened to the basilica. There actually are some still very large cannons in museums in Istanbul of this period, so we get some idea of it, although we don't think we can see one quite as big as this. But it was the ability to keep firing over a long period that does the damage, really. And I think, after a period, the basilica really, and it was too big to be repaired on the battlefield.
Did they try to, after the one, did they try to rebuild the basilica, and was it ever used again, or was it just for this battle?
We don't know. They absolutely have no idea, unfortunately. And one would love to know, because this was an extraordinary, iconic thing, and it obviously did a lot of damage, but it didn't survive the whole of the siege as a working machine.
Was it effective in the sense that it did the job, that it broke through the wall, or wasn't it that was more for this, like you said, the psychological effect for the people?
Well, we can't be we can't be certain. I mean, it certainly did do serious damage, and Constantine did have one or two cannons, but it's interesting. They revealed that the city walls were outdated, because when they put them on the tops of the towers, the vibration of the cannon was such that they were starting to weaken the towers, and therefore it was kind of one of the many reasons why these these city walls that go back to Greek and Roman times were obsolete. They were out of date. But we know that it did do a certain amount of damage. We just don't know how how long it fired for. Answering what happened to it afterwards, my guess is that because metal is extremely valuable, they would have melted it down and used it again for other cannons, that it just disappeared.
Something that I want to talk about as well is the Ottoman Navy. And what was the state of the Ottoman Navy like at this point?
Well, one of the reasons why Constantinople had been so difficult to take was that the Ottomans didn't have a navy, and so the city could always be resupplied by sea. But Mehmed, very clever tactician, realized that you actually needed a navy, and he had a lot of ships built at Gallipoli by Greek shipbuilders and manned by mainly Greek sailors, of about 70 oared galleys, and these sailed up towards the walls of Constantinople. This stunned the people of the city looking out to sea, because they'd never seen Ottoman ships. And there's a little harbor slightly up the coast where and the idea, of course, was to starve the city by sea and to challenge the chain. And there follows a period when the Pope eventually did send 3 large sailing ships, and there's a sea battle off the coast of off the walls of the city, watched by Mehmed on the shore and by all the population of Constantinople looking down. And the ships which arrive are high-sided sailing ships, and the galleys that Mehmed had are very low in the water, and they were simply incapable of stopping the arriving, although there are only 3 of these ships, of making their way up to the chain. The chain is open, they're let in, the chain is closed. And this is a humiliation for Mehmed. And it's one of those moments when you can start to see the morale of the people starting to question whether the city could be taken. It was a very humiliating, very public failure. What does Mehmed want? He wants to get rid of that chain. He wants to get ships into the Golden Horn so that he can threaten the city from the water. It would mean that the Byzantines would need to withdraw more troops from the land walls, because they were hardly defending the sea walls at all, and put a lot more pressure on them. So he does something which is absolutely extraordinary. From the little harbor, which is about 3 kilometers up the coast, he has ships hauled over land over one night into the Golden Horn behind the chain, and this stuns the people of the city. This again is a very curious story, much discussed. It actually involves the creation of a trackway, which has to be greased, hauling the ships, these are galleys, 70 ships, overland, uphill, down the other side, all in one night. And nobody knows. This is a great story. It's the subject of great stuff in Ottoman legend. Nobody knows really how this was done. There have been cases where this has been done before. The Venetians have done it. Generally, people would disassemble the ships, take them apart, and then reassemble them on the other side. So it remains a mystery. I mean, he did have access to a very large workforce, so maybe it could have been done in one day, but it remains one of those strange events. That there are all sorts of fantastic pieces of practical engineering going on in the siege. The cannon, the walls, the supply chains, and this business of moving these ships over land. But we don't really know actually, how it really worked out. I think we have to take it at face value and say, okay, maybe he did have the resources to do this. I mean, he had the size of Ottoman armies is always up for dispute. The Christians would say were 400,000 men there, but was probably about 80,000. But they would probably also have had a large number of servants, of people managing horses, and they could probably have drawn
Slaves,
on
I
a lot of
imagine.
people. I'm sorry?
Slaves too, I will imagine.
Yes, probably slaves. Yeah. People from conquered territories, probably from. I mean, there were a large number of Christians in their army who were compelled to come from the Balkans to fight. There wasn't a choice; they had to come. So he had lots of manpower. So maybe he could have done it in one night.
So, but the Byzantines do have extraordinary weapons which we still don't know the recipe today, called Greek fire. But at this point in time, how effective was it still effective, the Greek fire? At this point in time,
I think it was reasonably effective. you can only, as far as I can understand it, propel Greek fire over quite a short distance. You have to be very close. And going back centuries,
And was it used in this battle of?
It was used, yes. And you had a sort of, it was kind of a pump system, I think. Of course, you can't move it around very easily. Again, it was psychologically very frightening because when you, if it gets hold of somebody, they just burn like a candle, you know. And there are accounts from earlier times of people just going up and, you know. So it was extremely frightening, but not. Perhaps they did have it, they did use it. It was one of the secrets of the Greek world, although I think there's evidence actually that Arabs also, Islamic armies also had it in the crusading period. But it wasn't going to make the difference, I think. But it was used, and they did propel fire. People have to be quite close to you. They have to be storming your ramparts before you can, you know, I don't know, 10 meters, you know, not a big distance.
What about Giustiniani himself? How does he fight in this battle, and how critical is? We've been talked about this before in the beginning, but what does he do to battle the Ottomans, fight the Ottomans?
Well, he one of the things that happened is that as the walls started to collapse, and Giustiniani worked out that actually, if you replace stone wall with a mixture of earth ramparts and wood, these are quite effective because it's rather like throwing a stone into mud or something. Rather than destroying something, it sinks into the material. So he started to, he got the civilian population to help in this, to drag up earth and timber and so on, to create replacements for where the walls were broken. And on the top, where they had battlements, they put baskets with earth in them. And so these were quite effective defenses. He worked out where the most vulnerable parts of the wall were. There was one area in the center, which you can still see actually, where the land slopes down and it's strategically more difficult to defend. Concentrating troops in the critical points, moving troops around, and then making sallies, making little attacks out of the city walls through gates. One of the main things they needed to do, and one of the things that the Ottomans were most needed to do, was to fill in the moat, the deep trench, so that when their men came to the final attack, they would pass over level ground rather than having to drop down into a pit and up the other side. And they spent a lot of time throwing materials, even dead bodies, into the moat, which was dry, I think, at this point. We don't think there was any water in it, but it's still a deep ditch with deep sides and quite an obstacle for charging troops. But Giustiniani led or organized little attacks to go and try and clear out the moat so that it remained deep. So, and he attended to moving people around, concentrating fire where it was required, repairing the walls, maintaining the morale of the troops, really. They trusted him. This was a man who gave the defending troops great confidence. So really, he was the commander of the walls and really managing the most important part of the whole defensive operation.
Does he worry about payment at all? Because and again, I want to refer to the Netflix series here because it seemed to me like he in the series it kind of seemed like he was worried about it, and they had to start melting down Christian symbols, and they had to melt down silver from churches, etc., to be able to afford to pay him. Is that right?
I don't know about that. I've got no evidence. I mean, I think I have to say the Netflix series
Mm,
does fill in some gaps, really. That the idea that Mehmed himself was wounded by the basilica exploding and
mm.
so on. Um, I've I have no idea. I've got no. Turkish historians might have evidence of that, but I think if there was evidence, it would have showed up from the Christian sources. So I don't know what he'd been promised rewards of land, I think, in the Peloponnese by Constantine. Whether he was being paid along the way, quite probably, and there probably would have been. It's quite possible that in times of severe crisis, that the Byzantine population might have been prepared to melt down some of their religious possessions to pay people, but I've never seen any documentary evidence for that.
And Mehmed does try to send in miners to dig walls under to get into the city. And this is how did they discover this, that they send miners? He said try to dig caves sort of into the city.
Well, Mehmet who called on all the resources of his empire, and he got silver miners from Serbia to dig these tunnels. Again, Constantine was lucky that he had a mining engineer, Scottish mining engineer. It's an extraordinary story. Who'd been in Germany, a man called John.
How did he end up in
Well,
Constantinople of
we
all
don't know.
places?
It is absolutely fascinating. We absolutely don't know. It's a good Scottish name. He had come from Germany. I think we're seeing rather like Orban, we're seeing technical mercenaries who've got a skill to sell, traveling widely across Europe. And John Grant was one of those technical mercenaries who went to Germany. And we have no idea, unfortunately, how he came to be in Constantinople. No idea.
It didn't matter to them who won the war, it just mattered who paid the most.
Well, I think there's an element of that. Yeah, I mean, I think, fighting for the cause. There are an awful lot of people who are for whom war or things related to it is a business, really, and we see this in the 15th century, particularly in early 16th century in Italy. So unfortunately, I would love to know, and I was contacted by the Scottish Scottish family name, and I was contacted by the Grant clan, Scottish clan, if I could tell them anything about John Grant, but I couldn't find out anything about him, unfortunately. But what he did was he knew that when you mine under the walls, there will be vibration, and so what he did was he put down buckets of water by the walls, and if they started to ripple, he knew that the walls were being disturbed.
That's
And
quite genius.
this is probably a well-known technique, because effectively mining was one of the most effective techniques for getting into cities. What they were trying to do was actually to get into the city, as far as I could see. Conventionally, it became more common to mine under the walls, put explosives under there, and then blow up a bit of a wall. But they seem to be trying to actually get under the walls. So Grant, who obviously has a team of skilled miners with him, and of a certain number of them at least, they countermine. They dig mines to meet the mines of Mehmet's mines under the walls, and it's completely nightmarish. They break into the tunnels, and there's fighting in the dark. It's extraordinary, and pulling down the tunnels so that the Serbian miners are suffocated under the city walls. It's a kind of extraordinary. There are so many aspects to this contest. Really, you've got sea battles. You've got you've got siege machines. You've got big cannons. You've got as contests go, it's got everything really, I think, in terms of an extraordinary event. And so Mehmed's attempt to undermine the walls fails. And Mehmed's trying everything. He's dragged ships over the Golden Horn. He's got miners. He builds siege machines and tries to wheel them up to the walls and protects them with leather. But siege machines are always vulnerable, and they would be particularly vulnerable to Greek fire, and that failed as well. We don't know what happened to Grant. He was probably killed in the final thing. He just disappears. It's one of the many fascinating little stories within the big story that we all wish we knew more about, but we don't.
So how much battle did actually fighting that actually took place outside the city walls, and who were part of what kind of troops did Mehmed send? Because he had quite a number of different troops. And how does it? Is there fighting outside of the walls as well?
Yeah. Well, I mean, he has Christians, conscripted Christians. He has his crack troops, the Janissaries, and he has troops who are gathered from Ottoman Asia, and on three wings. And conventionally, what he did was he would send in the most disposable troops, who would be the Christians first, and he kept his best troops, the professional army corps, the Janissaries, until the end. But what the pattern was this, really, that they would attack a certain section of wall intensely, bring it down, and try and fill in the moat, and then stage an attack along, you actually usually quite a narrow area, 10, 15, 20 meters, not a big area. So that would be a rush, really. And of course, these are quite easy to defend as long as you can move your men fast enough. And so we tend to see these attacks whenever a good section, or not, when a good section of wall has been taken down, you would see an attack, and they would fill in the moat as quickly as they could and advance. And these were beaten back pretty well, actually. Justiniani, I think, ensured that his troops were quite mobile. They could be moved up and down the wall very quickly, actually. It has to be said, they didn't have enough men, although there are two levels of wall, they didn't have enough men to defend the outer wall, really. So they were effectively defending the inner wall. But as the walls came down, then, or the outer wall came down, then they would be forced to send men into that sector to repel an attack. So this pattern emerges: collapse of wall, mass attack, good defense, and then the troops would withdraw. Quite a lot of people would be killed, but more on the Ottoman side. But all the time, the Christian numbers are being reduced. And the one thing the Christians don't have is a large number of men. They had about 7,000, and we think the Ottomans had about 80,000, although, as I say, counting crowds is very difficult. But all the time, of course, the number of defenders is being reduced. This is the loss of every Byzantine soldier is probably worth 10 Ottoman soldiers.
And did Justiniani fight outside the walls himself, or do you have a count?
I don't know whether he actually did. I suspect that he didn't, but I know in the Netflix series that he fights outside the walls, doesn't he? We don't know, really. I would think that the commander, is probably not going to risk himself. He may have done. We don't know. And we have to say the Netflix series fills in a lot. We do not have documentary evidence either for or against that.
What about Constantine himself? How What does he do during the siege? Does he command himself, or does he let mostly
Con-
everything to?
Constantine does command bodies of troops along the walls, and is very much, as far as we can see, in the front line. He's there at the walls. This is where it's all happening. And so he is a soldier, although, you know, he really gives overall command to Justiniani, but he must have had a big contribution to make into how the defenses were being managed.
Was he a good commander, Constantine?
I'm sorry?
Was he a good commander himself, Constantine?
Yes, he was. Yeah, he was a skilled professional soldier. He was, and his presence on the walls undoubtedly was very good for the morale of the troops. Your commander needs to be seen, you know, and this man was a skilled soldier. He was a practical man. So, you know, he knew quite a bit about. He actually knew a certain amount about siege warfare because he had some experience of trying to defend the Peloponnese against the Ottomans involving walls. So he would have been very much in the front line as well. On one sec, there was one section of the wall that he personally managed.
Something that we haven't discussed mentioned, and I don't know if you can answer this enough, but what about the people themselves that were living in Constantinople at this point? How did they? What was the effect of the battle for them like?
Well, the people, the ordinary people of the city.
Yeah.
Well, it's difficult really because many of the Greeks refused to participate because of this religious problem between the Catholics and the Greek Orthodox. So it was incredibly difficult for Constantine to, I mean, they did contribute. We hear of people, as I said, being involved in bringing up earth and timber to the walls. But there was a strong element in the city that refused to cooperate, particularly around the Greek patriarch, whose name I've forgotten at the moment, who really said, rather the Sultan's turban than the cardinal's hat, i.e., rather, you know, they just loathed, and Constantine had done this deal really with, you know, where he had personally submitted to the Pope, and this meant that the great mother church of Hagia Sophia was boycotted by the Greek Orthodox population during almost.
Did they feel like he betrayed them in a sense?
Yes, they did. They did. And behind this, of course, lies the siege of the Fourth Crusade of 1204, when of course, Catholics, Venetians, Western Christians came and sacked their city. So they've got deep history here. So it's very difficult for Constantine, really, to mobilize all the resources of the population in an effective way. He was in an incredibly difficult situation.
Now, something that I haven't brought up so far, and I think is essential to do, because he does send requests for Venetian fleet, and it is on its way, but why does it never arrive? And do we have a count of why it doesn't come to aid?
Really, because, well, the papacy is not convinced by the submission, I think. The Venetians, who are the people who are best placed to send a fleet, Venetians are always playing the game from both sides. They're cautious. They see which way the wind blows. They're doing a lot of trade with the Ottomans. Furthermore, Christian Europe has memories of two disastrous crusades, the last one being at Varna on the coast of the Black Sea in 1446, where a Christian army is completely wiped out. So it's extremely, there's a great deal of debate and I think the Venetian Senate at one point voted not to send aid to the city, that they were realistic that this city has had it anyway, and we're not going to. Venetians earn a continuous reputation, certainly from the Pope, for not being Christians at all. Venetians said we're Venetians first, then Christians, and so really, I think two things: there wasn't quite the will, and secondly, I think they, to a certain extent, I think they didn't really understand how bad the situation was. Constantinople had been there for 1100 years. It seemed like the eternal city, and it was almost impossible for them to believe that it wasn't there. So I think there was kind of an information gap, you could say, between, oh, we've had these sieges before and so on, that and perhaps a more realistic sense that the Ottomans, taking on the Ottomans, making these long-range expeditions was always going to lead to disaster.
So he finally enters the city, the Mehmed, and who does he send first when the city gates are finally open?
Well, I think initially people pour in through the walls, over the walls, and then start to make their way into the city. It's difficult to say which troops it was.
Was it the Janissaries or?
Well, I think the Janissaries would have. It probably was the Janissaries actually, because when it came to the final attack, when the defenders are overwhelmed between the two walls, and they make their way into the city, and of course then they start to kill people, and then they advance fairly quickly down the main streets, and the people flee or they hide in houses and so on. And the defense, there's very little defense inside the city, that collapses. And there's said to be about 10,000 people inside Hagia Sophia, which is quite possible. It is the most enormous building, very impressive. And eventually, when it's died down a bit, Mehmed makes a triumphal entry through the city gates, which is the subject of a very famous 19th century painting, which used to be on the walls and probably is again of many Istanbul tea shops, and makes his way down into the heart of the city.
So I actually want to rewind a little bit before we move on, because Giustini managed to escape when he realized the battle is lost, and he is in the sources branded a coward for this. But would you blame him for this, and would you say he was a coward?
I think what happened was that Constantine marched all his troops between the inner and the outer walls, locked the gates behind him, and they were going to go down to the last man. Justiniani is undoubtedly very badly wounded, although nobody can actually see. He's been hit somewhere under his breastplate. And he turns to Constantine and says, "You need to give me the key to the gate. I have to go." And Constantine says, "Well, if you go, we're lost, because you are the iconic figure, And I think we must." Justiniani was probably exhausted. He'd been fighting for 7 weeks.
Can you blame him for wanting to?
I don't think I can blame him, but of course it was the disaster. If he had stayed and just collapsed on the ground, this happened quite often actually. It happened at the siege of Acre in 1291, when the master of the Templars was very badly wounded, and everybody says, if you go, the siege, the defense will collapse, and it did. So conventionally, I think that when your leader flees, if you can put it like that, then this is the beginning of the end. I don't think I would blame him personally, but Constantine was right. This was a signal for the complete collapse. And he did get away, and he did die 11 days later back on his home island. And curses were called upon him. So I don't know whether I blame him or not. He should have stayed, I suppose. He should have stayed, but he was a dead man. You know, obviously wasn't dead at that moment. So, but it was an instrumental moment. It was the moment that changed that people gave up.
I try actually while we were recording, I tried to find this speech, but constant, and it's been stated that it may have been added later in sources of people that may not have been there at the battle. But Constantine had quite an epic speech, according to that said it may be over exaggeration. But can you tell me about this speech that he has? Because I tried to remember it. I've seen it before, but I tried to look it up. But can you
Is this
tell me about his
is,
final
is,
speech?
is this before the final attack?
And it runs in that and disappears. And I think he has a speech that's I don't remember this. Like I said, I don't remember the speech itself. I'm gonna try to look it up. But
I mean, the
but I think it's been added to later sources, perhaps in because it was you know, I don't hold on, there we go. Maybe I find it now. Final speech of Emperor Constantine. Sorry, it's just that I tried to find it, but
I mean, before the on the night before the
oh yeah, here we go. Most noble leader, illustrators, tribunes, general, most courageous fellow soldiers, and loyal, honest citizens. You know well that the hour has come. The enemy of our faith wishes to oppress us even more closely by sea and land, with all his engines and skill to attack us with the entire strength of his siege force. A snake about to spew his venom, he is in a hurry to devour us like a savage lion. For this reason I am imploring you to fight like men with brave souls, as you have done from the beginning up to this day against the enemy of our faith. I hand over to you my glorious, famous, respected, noble city, the shining queen of cities, our home now. You know well, my brothers, that we have 4 obligations in common, which force us to prefer death over survival. First, our faith and piety. Second, our homeland. Third, the emperor anointed by the Lord. And fourth, our relatives and friends. Well, my brothers, if we must fight for one of these obligations, we will be even more liable and the command strength of all 4, as you can clearly understand. If God grants victory to the impious because of my own sins, we will endanger our lives of our holy faith with Christ, which Christ gave his own blood. This is most important of all, even if one gains the entire world but loses his soul in the process, that will it benefit. Second, we will be deprived of such famous homeland and of our liberty. Third, our empire, renowned in the past but presently humbled, low, and exhausted, will be ruled by a tyrant and an imposed man. Fourth, we will be separated from our dearest children, wives, and relatives. This wretch of a sultan has besieged our city, but up to now for 57 days with all his engines and strength. He has relaxed the blockade neither day nor night, but by the grace of Christ our Lord, who sees all things, the enemy has often been repelled up to now from our walls with shame and dishonor. Yet to my brothers feel no cowardice, even if small parts of our fortifications have collapsed from the explosions and engine missiles. As you can see, we made possible necessary repairs. We are placing all hope in the irresistible glory of God. Some have faith in our men and others in cavalry, might and numbers, but we believe in the name of our Lord, our Savior, and second in our arms and strength granted to us by divine power. I know the countless hordes of the imposed will advise us against us according to the customs. violently, confidently, and great courage and force in order to overwhelm and wear out our few defenders with hardship. They attempt to frighten us with loud yells and inaudible battle cries. I'm not going to read the entire speech, but it ends with something. Well, my brothers, well then, my brothers and fellow soldiers, be prepared for the morning with the grace of by and strength granted you by the God, and with help from our Holy Trinity, in which we have placed all our hope. Let's force the enemy to depart from here in shame.
Which book does that come from?
I'm not sure the sources.
Yeah.
It says here, the fall of the Byzantine Empire, chronicled by George Francis, 1401-1407.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's really interesting, actually. It is.
It's quite a long speech, but
yeah, yeah. The sources have been made complicated, but it's a forgery, not a modern forgery, about 100 years later, by a man, by a priest. There was a guy called George Francis who was Constantine's best friend, and he wrote an account. It's not very long. He actually survived and ended up in a monastery in Greece, although his wife, his children were taken into the harem, and I think they were killed. And for a long time, it was thought that he had written a short account and a long account, but it now appears that what you've just read was written 100 years later by a priest, and it's a forgery. It's not a modern forgery. It's a sort of 16th century forgery. So we unfortunately, in real terms, we have very, very little that we know that the Constantine actually said. So it's not authentic.
It's quite a long read as well. So I would.
But it took historians a long time to work out that this wasn't actually a real a thing written by the original George Francis. Quite interesting piece of historiography, really.
Yeah, and Mehmed enters the city, and he's awestruck. So how awestruck is he when he see Hagia Sophia for the first time?
I think he is deeply moved, really. I think it is the most extraordinary building. You know, it is. I mean, it is a miraculous building inside. This is a building from the 6th century AD, I think there's two things. I think one is that he is perhaps overcome, I think, by the splendor of the church. Secondly, it is that he has fulfilled an Islamic prophecy that goes back hundreds of years. You know, that he is the man who has fulfilled the words of the Prophet Muhammad, although actually a lot of those words were forgeries anyway, but that he didn't know that. And so yeah, and yet there's a strange thing that he said, that, you know, he climbs up onto the roof and he can survey the whole city, and there's almost kind of like a moment of anticlimax when he gets up there. You know how it is. He remembers a couple of lines about how spiders take over palaces, the owls hoot in castles that have been destroyed, almost as though, you know how it is when you aim to do something and you do it, and it's everything that you've been wanted for, and then you've done it. Almost like a feeling of
emptiness,
melancholy, yeah, involved in that. I mean, somebody said, I'm just reading from my own book here. I don't know where the quote comes from. It obviously came from somebody at the time. He thought of the impermanence and instability of this world and its ultimate destruction. And he can look down from there and see this great city being plundered in front of his eyes. So it's a strange moment. He's overcome with awe and achievement, and then thinking, this is kind of, well, I've done it, and what does it all mean? It's kind of quite a modern feeling, really, I think.
I would ask about the people after the city was conquered. Did they realize that, oh, I guess we're not Romans anymore, I guess we're Ottomans now? Or how did they feel after the city was conquered?
I think a lot of the population would march off into slavery, and there had to be a sort of repopulation. But he allowed the Greeks to be affairs in the city to be run by their own patriarch, really. So they had a certain amount of freedom. I don't know how the Greeks of that probably didn't think of themselves as Ottomans. They thought of themselves as Greeks. They thought of themselves as Byzantines, and I think how they identified themselves is quite difficult to know. The Sultan was obviously their lord and master, but as long as they behaved themselves, Greek worship went on, and actually a very high percentage of the population continued to be Greek well into the 19th century. We don't really know how they identified themselves as subjects of the Sultan, but I don't think
he did look at himself as emperor of Rome as well, right?
Yeah,
Kaiser und Rom, that he was a successor of the Roman Empire.
Yes, yeah, he did. He was terribly keen to get this title, as as this was a survivor of the Roman Empire. The title of Emperor of Rome was very important to him. He was very into those kinds of, sort of fame, really, I suppose. And curiously, the
Is he recognized as this?
Not outside of they called European the European side of the Ottoman Empire Rome, but it was an ambition, really, that continued to linger for a couple of hundred, well, certainly for at least a century and a half, a century maybe, of successive sultans wanting to actually capture Rome and be. But the title of Caesar, calling yourself Caesar, was a very important one to Mehmed.
How does it go on about rebuilding Constantinople after the siege itself?
I'm sorry?
How does it go on about rebuilding Constantinople?
Well, yeah, I mean, it was wrecked. It wasn't totally wrecked. I think he sort of stopped the looting. I don't know too much about that. I mean, I think what we're going to see, of course, is we're going to see the whole skyline of the city change with mosques. One of the first.
There is a very famous painting where after, I don't remember, it's in the book by Robin Cormac, but I don't remember the painting and the name where you see the city skyline of Istanbul, Constantinople after Mehmed has taken over the city.
Yeah. I mean, I think, I think there would have been quite large empty spaces. I mean, the city had shrunk so much under with the decline of Byzantines that they were growing crops inside the walls. It was almost like sort of separate villages in different areas. So there was a long, slow rebuilding process, I think, of recreating the city fabric. And of course, the big one is going to come after Mehmed's time, I think, with the building of the Topkapi Palace. And I can't remember when, which was on the site of the old Byzantine Acropolis. But I think it takes a long time, and it takes a long time to get the population back up. They had to encourage people, or even force people. They forcibly move people from Asia Minor to come and live in the city. So this is quite a long process, I think.
And of course, a few decades later, Salim would conquer most what we know as unmatched Ottoman Empire at its height, and it would be closest to Rome, the Roman Empire, since the Roman Empire.
Yeah. And so, yeah, I mean, I think the Ottomans probably reached their peak in the following century with Suleiman the Magnificent, of which the Turks have created another blockbuster. I don't know if it's available with subtitles, called The Magnificent Century, about Suleiman the Magnificent. What they did was they bring back to life a dying city. This is a city that was dying with a small population, a crumbling infrastructure, and so they rebuild. They have to rebuild quite a lot of aqueducts, bringing water into the city and so on. So they really bring a dying city back to life, if you want to look at it in objective terms, although the Greeks wouldn't like that idea.
Of course, I have to ask, what business was it of the Turks to change it from Constantinople to Istanbul?
Well, yeah, it's interesting that Istanbul is a corruption, I think, of the Greek Aestin Polin. Which means I'm going Aestin Polin into the city, and that became Istanbul. But actually, I think they went on calling it Constantinople for quite a long time because of the prestige that surrounded their city. And I couldn't trace the point at which Istanbul becomes the main
I just
name.
asked nobody's business but the Turks.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, Istanbul, Constantinople. Great song.
But it seemed to me that it wasn't Istanbul officially until 1923.
Right. Okay. You're probably right.
I don't know. I may be wrong. It seemed.
I mean, it could well be. I mean, the rest of Europe was going on calling it Constantinople. It may be that sort of Turks themselves use, particularly people who weren't in diplomatic circles called it Istanbul. But it's one of those. It's one of the many fascinating sort of multiple identities of the city, I think.
Thank you so much for coming. It's been an honor to have you on this podcast. And do you have anything you wish to promote, any social media you wish to share if people want to find your work? Or
no, I mean, I think I've got a website. The last book I wrote was called The Accursed Tower, and it was about the siege which ends the Crusades of Acre in 1291. And it's interesting because a lot of the practices that the Islamic armies employed at Acre, well, those that they employed at Constantinople in 200 years later. And so the practice of Islamic warfare, which the Ottomans inherited from the Islamic world, was very deep. And you can see the same kind of things going on: the use of noise, the use of Greek fire, the way the morale of the defenders collapses when a key figure is killed. They were using giant catapults at that time rather than cannons, but with the same kind of problems of getting all the equipment together, mining the stone, the skills for warfare. And I'm very interested in those kind of technological. I'm not a scientist or an engineer, but I'm very interested in medieval technology. How did they do that? You know, how do you transport an elephant from India to Venice or something? You know, all that kind of stuff. And they're very interesting questions. You know, how did the Ottomans manage to drag their ships over the Golden Horn? You know, and these are fascinating practical engineering questions, and I think we underestimate the sheer practical skills of the people of the past.
Something of it I did forget to ask about is we mentioned him in the beginning. What happens to Lotus Notares after the battle?
He's killed. He's captured. They kept him alive for a bit, and then they realized that he was perhaps a too significant figure. I think his wife and children survived, but there's cruelty here. The children are taken off into the harem, and the same with this other man, George Francis, who ends up in a monastery with his wife. They get away, but his children are taken into the harem and die there. Notares is killed. Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming. This has been Murad III. Today we have taken a look at the battle and fall of Constantinople. We are available on social media on Instagram for that age 12. And you can find our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you can find podcasts. We are also on YouTube for that age 12. Thank you so much for coming on. It's been a pleasure. Please like, share, and subscribe. And I'll see you next time.
Thank you very much, Erland.
It's been a pleasure.